The storm's here. No time left. Lightning flashed. Radios died, and the cabin filled with chaos. Then she stood, calm, precise, and took command like she'd done it before. But when the National Guard arrived, why did their commander salute her before speaking? And who exactly was this woman they'd all ignored? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Helen Ross, 62, had once been a battlefield nurse, wife of the late Lieutenant Colonel Edward Ross, a military legend who had passed away 3 years ago from lung cancer. Since the memorial service, she had lived quietly, avoiding veteran groups, never mentioning uniforms, never demanding respect. The military chapter of her life seemed closed, at least to outsiders, but in the privacy of her modest home, maps still hung on walls, and emergency protocols remained fixed in her mind, like prayers. When the invitation arrived for the Winter Readiness Retreat, a training program combining civilians and veterans, Helen surprised herself by accepting. Perhaps it was the third anniversary of Edward's death approaching, or perhaps the emptiness of her calendar that made her check yes on the RSVP. "I'll just help in the kitchen," she told the coordinator over the phone. "No need for anyone to notice me." The coordinator, a young man with an enthusiastic voice, seemed relieved. "Perfect. We always need support staff. The actual training can get pretty intense." Helen didn't correct him, didn't mention her 4 tours in Afghanistan, her advanced medical training, or the Bronze Star tucked away in her dresser drawer. Instead, she packed sensibly, thick socks, waterproof boots, and extra layers. But in her bag alongside her clothing, she quietly included an emergency medical chart, topographical maps, and Edward's old radio transceiver. Old habits, she thought, just in case. The retreat center stood nestled in the mountains, 3 hours from the nearest hospital and 45 minutes from the closest town. An ideal location for wilderness training, or a perfect setup for disaster if things went wrong. On the first day, Helen quickly realized she was the oldest person present by at least 2 decades. The other participants were energetic, boisterous, and clearly had some training from the National Guard or rescue organizations. They wore their credentials like badges, dropping terms like tactical assessment and command protocol into casual conversation. They called her the tea lady or the widow. No one asked what she had done. No one knew she had advanced medical training, tactical coordination skills, and over 4 years working at forward operating bases in Afghanistan, alongside her husband. During the orientation, the lead instructor, a muscular former Marine named Cole, divided everyone into specialty groups: command, medical, technical, and coordination. Helen sat quietly in the back, waiting to be assigned to food service or administration. Cole never called her name. After the meeting, a 20-year-old with a fresh crew cut and a National Guard t-shirt laughed. "Hey, Miss Helen, you're good at making porridge, right? Why don't you stay in the kitchen area?" Helen just smiled softly. "Yes, that works. Someone needs to organize supplies there anyway." She watched them during the first 2 days of training exercises, noting the gaps in their planning, the overlooked contingencies, the casual approach to equipment checks. She said nothing, just observed as she prepared meals and cleaned up afterward. On the third day, weather alerts began coming through. A level 4 snowstorm was approaching, expected to hit 12 hours earlier than initially forecast. The mountain passes would become impassable. Communications might be compromised. Helen approached Cole during the morning briefing. "We should activate the internal evacuation protocol early," she suggested quietly. "The storm's accelerating." He barely glanced at her. "Thanks for your concern, Mrs. Ross. Just keep the coffee coming. We'll handle the tactical decision." She turned away, carrying the empty coffee pot back to the kitchen. But internally, she knew they didn't understand what was coming. "If you believe people with real experience deserve a seat at the table, stay with us." That night, the storm arrived with a vengeance, hours ahead of even Helen's prediction. Wind howled around the wooden cabins, transforming from distant moan to present danger within minutes. Trees bent at alarming angles, and the sky turned an unnatural charcoal gray at only 4 in the afternoon. Snow began falling, so heavily that the windows became white screens, obscuring everything beyond. Radio signals deteriorated rapidly. Cell phone coverage dropped to almost nothing. A single flickering bar that disappeared if you moved 3 steps in any direction. A group of trainees who had left camp that afternoon for a navigation exercise hadn't returned. 2 vans, 14 people, including one of the medical instructors. Their last check-in had placed them near the western ridge, but that was nearly 2 hours ago. In the main cabin, chaos began to unfold. Cole, for all his confidence in fair weather, had never managed a genuine emergency with lives at stake. His face had grown pale, his orders contradictory. Helen sat in the corner of the room, quietly observing the escalating panic. Each group ran in different directions, no one making cohesive decisions. Maps scattered across tables, radios crackled with static rather than information. "We need a medic," someone shouted as a young trainee slipped on the snow-packed entryway, gashing his knee on exposed metal from a broken chair leg. Helen was the first to reach him, kneeling beside the injured man as blood pooled on the wooden floor. With calm efficiency, she applied firm pressure, then reached for a clean cloth from her pocket. "This is arterial bleeding. Apply firm pressure, avoid excessive movement," she instructed, her voice steady amid the commotion. The room fell silent. She rose to her feet, walked directly to the emergency cabinet, and pulled out a binder, labeled Emergency Command Protocol. She laid it open on the central table, flipping to a tab section marked Communications Failure. "I need someone to read aloud the missing team roster, someone else to open the Western region map, and another person to check the generator fuel levels," she said, her voice commanding, without being loud. People remained frozen, uncertain of this sudden shift in authority. "Under whose orders?" one of the younger instructors finally challenged. Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing a combat field nurse insignia and a logistics command unit badge worn on a simple leather band around her wrist. "You're a command-level officer?" a young man stammered. Helen neither confirmed nor denied. Rank no longer mattered to her. Capability did. "I've trained frontline evacuation teams in conditions with no maps, no electricity, and no hope of rescue," she stated simply, "and I know that if we don't act now, people won't survive the night." Something in her voice, perhaps its quiet certainty, broke through the paralysis. People began moving, taking positions at her direction. Within 40 minutes, Helen's temporarily commanded group had established the probable location of the missing team, based on their last known coordinates, wind patterns, and the most logical shelter option. "They're likely in the timber cabin 2 miles northeast," she said, circling a location on the map. "It has no power source but should have an emergency propane heater." One of the younger men, the same one who had suggested she stick to making porridge, now looked at her with newfound respect. "How can we reach them? The vehicles can't navigate in this." Helen unfolded a topographical map, marked with notations in her precise handwriting. "There's a maintenance access route that follows the ridge, less exposed to wind. We need a 4-person team with emergency supply." "I'll go," offered the young man immediately. Helen nodded. "Take Harris, Chen, and Patel. Double layer everything. Take the emergency medical pack, 2 emergency beacons, and the hand crank radio. Check in every 15 minutes. As they prepared to leave, Helen approached the young man. Ryan, according to his name tag. She adjusted his scarf, tucking it more securely. "When you find them, don't move anyone immediately. Check for hypothermia first," she instructed. Ryan hesitated. "How did you know there was an access route? It's not on the standard map." Helen's eyes grew distant for a moment. "My husband and I used to train units in these mountains 20 years ago, but some things you don't forget." As the rescue team departed, Cole approached Helen, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by uncertainty. "Mrs. Ross, I didn't realize." "Now isn't the time," she interrupted gently. "We need to establish a communication relay and prepare the medical station. The missing team will have at least some degree of exposure." For the next 2 hours, Helen transformed the chaotic cabin into an organized command center. She assigned roles based on aptitude, rather than prior titles. She established shifts for monitoring the emergency radio. She instructed the remaining medical staff on treating hypothermia and frostbite. Throughout it all, she never raised her voice, never needed to. The authority in her calm instructions was more compelling than any shouted order. At midnight, the hand crank radio crackled to life. Ryan's voice broke through the static. "Command, this is rescue team. We found them, 2 with minor frostbite, 1 with a sprained ankle, all alive." A cheer erupted in the cabin. Helen allowed herself a small smile before returning to the map to plot their return route. Type believe, if you've ever seen someone overlooked, who ended up saving the entire group. At 3 in the morning, a convoy of National Guard vehicles finally reached the retreat center. They had been mobilized after Helen managed to establish a fragile connection to the outside world. Using Edward's old transceiver, modified with a makeshift antenna, she had constructed from kitchen utensils and copper wire. The storm had intensified further, transforming the mountain landscape into an almost otherworldly terrain. Trees bowed under the weight of accumulated snow. Power lines had collapsed along the main access road. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, making every minute of exposure potentially lethal. Yet amid this natural onslaught, Helen had created a pocket of order and functionality. When Major Stephen Crane, the National Guard team leader, stepped into the cabin, he was met with an unexpectedly organized scene. Medical treatment areas were clearly marked with improvised signs. Teams worked with purpose, rotating through designated rest periods. Updated maps covered the walls with current conditions, danger zones, and escape routes, all meticulously noted in different colors to indicate priority and risk level. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, brushing snow from his uniform, as his team of 8 followed him inside. Without hesitation, everyone pointed toward the silver-haired woman, updating a handwritten status report at the command table. Major Crane walked over, stood at attention, and offered a formal military salute. Helen looked up from her paperwork, rose to her feet with a fluid motion that belied her age, and returned the salute with practiced precision. "Nurse Turner," the major asked, recognition dawning in his eyes. Helen's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "Yes, but tonight I'm just the incident commander. We served in the same mass unit in Kandahar 2004, he explained. "I was a junior medic then. You taught the trauma response course." Helen studied his face, memory flickering across her features. "Of course, Lieutenant Crane, you had quite a steady hand under pressure." "It's Major now," he replied with a respectful nod, "and I still remember your first lesson. In chaos, create structure. In panic, enforce calm." As Helen briefed the National Guard team on the situation, the retreat participants watched in silent amazement. The woman they had relegated to kitchen duty was now discussing evacuation strategies with military precision, using terminology that betrayed years of professional experience. Major Crane's team deferred to her assessment without question, clearly recognizing the competence behind her recommendations. "Your communication protocols remained intact throughout," the major noted. "We've been delayed because no one else could coordinate properly across the affected area. 3 other groups are still unaccounted for on the eastern slope." Helen nodded gravely. "We have topo maps of the eastern quadrants with marked shelters." She gestured to a young woman who had been assisting her. "Nina here has been tracking weather patterns. There's a narrow corridor that should have reduced wind speed. They'd likely head there if they're following proper procedure." The major turned to his communications specialist. "Relay those coordinates to the second response team." By dawn, all missing personnel had been recovered, minor injuries treated, and the retreat center secured against the storm's continued assault. The National Guard commander had recommended full evacuation once the weather permitted, but until then, the center would remain in emergency operation mode. Helen finally allowed herself to rest, sinking into a chair near the fire. Ryan approached her, offering a cup of hot tea. "Miss Ross," he began awkwardly, "I'm sorry about what I said earlier, about the kitchen and porridge. I had no idea who you were." Helen accepted the tea with a tired smile. "There's no need to apologize. I didn't come here to impress anyone." "But you saved us," Ryan insisted. "You knew exactly what to do when everyone else was panicking. Where did you learn all that?" Helen's gaze drifted to the window, where the blizzard continued its assault. "My husband and I were deployed together for most of our careers. He commanded combat units. I ran field hospitals." "You learn quickly when mistakes cost lives." Ryan hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone when you arrived? I mean, about your experience." Helen sipped her tea thoughtfully. "When you've spent decades in uniform, you learn that competence speaks louder than credentials. I didn't come here to teach or lead. I came here to remember." "Remember what?" Ryan asked. "What it feels like to be part of something larger than yourself," she replied softly, "even if only from the periphery." Word of Helen's leadership spread quickly among the retreat participants. People who had barely noticed her existence the day before now approached with questions, seeking advice, offering belated respect. Cole, the former instructor, who had dismissed her warning, found her later that morning. His confident demeanor had replaced by genuine humility. "Miss Ross," he said, clearly struggling with the words, "I owe you an apology. I should have listened when you suggested early evacuation." Helen shook her head. "In crisis management, we don't waste time on regrets. We learn and move forward." "I've been leading these retreats for 4 years," he admitted, "but I've never faced a real emergency, just simulations, controlled environments. That's the problem with training," Helen observed, without judgment. "The stakes are never quite real until they are." By afternoon,
The storm had weakened enough for news helicopters to attempt coverage. A local reporter managed to reach the center, eager for a story about the dramatic rescue. "We understand a retired military nurse took command during the crisis," the reporter said to Cole. "Can we speak with her?" Helen, overhearing this, tried to slip away to the kitchen, but Ryan gently blocked her path. "They should know what you did," he encouraged. Helen shook her head. "This isn't about me." "With respect, Mrs. Ross," Major Crane interjected, having overheard the exchange. "It should." Too often, the quiet professionals fade into the background. Your example tonight, calm leadership under pressure. That's a story people need to hear. The story broke that evening across regional news channels, first as a human interest piece about a snowbound training exercise, then evolving into something more profound as details emerge. "Widow takes command, Forgotten Veteran saves retreat center in catastrophic storm," read one headline. The accompanying photo showed Helen in her simple blue sweater, pointing to a map surrounded by military and civilian emergency personnel who were clearly deferring to her judgment. When asked, during a brief interview, why she hadn't mentioned her background from the beginning, Helen gave a response that would be quoted in veterans' newsletters for months afterward. "I don't need anyone to remember what I've done. I just need to remember that, when the moment calls, I can still stand up." In the days that followed, as the retreat participants returned to their normal lives, Helen's phone began ringing with calls from military organizations, veterans groups, and emergency management agencies. The woman, who had lived in quiet anonymity for 3 years after her husband's death, suddenly found herself reluctantly in the spotlight. The most surprising call came from General Adrian Blake, her husband's former commanding officer. "Helen," he said when she answered, "Edward would have been proud beyond words." "I was just doing what needed to be done," she replied. "Exactly," the general agreed. "That's why I'm called." The National Guard's Mountain Rescue Training Program needs someone with your experience, not as a nurse but as a tactical instructor. Helen's first instinct was to decline. She had built a quiet life after Edward's passing, one without uniforms, or rank, or responsibility for others' lives. But as she looked around her empty living room, at the maps she still kept on the walls, and the emergency protocols she still reviewed each month, she realized something important. Her skills hadn't retired when she had. "I'm not looking for a second career, Adrian," she said carefully. "I'm not offering one," he replied. "I'm asking you to share what you know before it's lost. 2 weekends a month, no uniform required, just your experience." After a long pause, Helen found herself saying, "Send me the details, I'll consider it." When she hung up, she walked to the closet and opened the door she had kept closed for 3 years. Edward's uniforms hung there, preserved in plastic. She touched the sleeve of his dress uniform gently. "What do you think, Edward?" she whispered. "One more mission." Though no answer came, she felt a certainty she hadn't experienced since before his diagnosis. Some skills weren't meant to be packed away, regardless of age or circumstance. Some knowledge needed to be passed on. Type justice, if you believe calm and real experience are still the most valuable things. 2 weeks later, Helen was invited to speak at a ceremony honoring the rescue operation. She hesitated before accepting, unsure if she belonged on a stage, receiving recognition for doing what had once been her daily responsibility. On the morning of the event, she opened her closet and stared at her own formal attire, untouched for years. Instead, she reached for Edward's old field jacket, the one he had worn off duty with patches from their shared deployments. She pinned her own service badge to the collar and tucked a worn leather binder with charred edges into a pocket. The binder had survived a field hospital fire in Kabul, a reminder of how fragile systems could be, how quickly order could descend into chaos. Edward had salvaged it from the ashes and given it to her as a kind of talisman. "As long as you have your protocols," he joked, "the world can't fall completely apart." The auditorium was filled with emergency responders, military personnel, and the participants she had guided through the crisis. As Helen was introduced, a hush fell over the crowd. She approached the podium slowly, her posture military straight, despite her years. The jacket hung slightly large on her frame, but somehow it looked exactly right. "I am not a general," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I no longer hold any." She paused, surveying the audience, meeting the eyes of young Ryan in the third row, of Cole near the back, of Major Crane, who had saluted her that night. "But I have stood in the midst of gunfire, and I knew when the snowstorm hit, I could still." She spoke briefly about preparedness, about the thin line between order and chaos, about how knowledge carried within oneself never expires. She didn't mention heroism or courage, Those words belonged to recruitment posters, not to people who had seen what she had seen. Instead, she spoke of responsibility. In a crisis, titles matter less than capability. Experience matters more than authority. And sometimes the person you overlook is exactly the one you'll need when systems fail. She paused, running her fingers over the charred edge of the binder she had placed on the podium. I learned this lesson early in my career. During a mortar attack, our commanding officer was incapacitated. The soldier who took command and organized our evacuation wasn't the highest-ranking person present. He was a communications specialist who had survived 3 previous attacks. He knew what to do because he had lived through it before. Helen looked up, meeting the audience's gaze directly. We live in a society that often values credentials over experience, confidence over competence. But when the storm hits, whether literal or metaphorical, what matters is not what's written on your name badge, but what you carry inside. When she finished, the applause thundered through the room. Helen nodded once in acknowledgement, then stepped away from the microphone, eager to return to her seat and the relative anonymity it offered. As the ceremony concluded, a group of young Guard members approached, asking for a photograph with her. Helen agreed reluctantly, standing straight as they gathered around. One young woman, barely 20 by the look of her, whispered a question. "Ma'am, where can I learn skills like yours?" Helen smiled gently, placing a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Not where, but when. And when you're willing to take responsibility." The young woman nodded, absorbing this. "I'm being deployed next month. I'm nervous." Helen studied her face, recognizing the blend of fear and determination she had seen in so many young faces over the years. "Remember this," she said softly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to think clearly despite it. Watch the experienced ones, learn their habits, and when the moment comes, trust yourself to rise to it." Later, as Helen prepared to leave, General Blake approached with a small box in his hand. "The secretary wanted you to have this," he said, offering her the package. Inside lay a simple medal, not military issue, but a civilian honor for extraordinary service. Helen started to protest, but Blake shook his head. "It's not for what you did in the past. It's for what you taught them that night." Sometimes the most important lesson is seeing quiet competence in action. The following Monday, Helen did something she hadn't done since Edward's passing. She drove to the Veterans Affairs office and asked about volunteer opportunity. The receptionist handed her a form listing options: hospital visitation, administrative support, peer counseling. Helen checked emergency preparedness training and added a note: available to assist with disaster response protocols and field medicine training. As she drove home that evening, Helen's mind filled not with memories of the crisis, but with possibilities for the future. The National Guard training position waited for her decision. A local emergency management office had requested consultation on their protocol. Ryan had asked if she would speak to his college class about crisis leadership. For 3 years, she had lived in the past, preserving memories, but keeping her capabilities locked away. Now, as she hung Edward's jacket carefully in the closet, she left it at the front, accessible, ready. On the dresser, she placed the civilian medal beside Edward's military honors. Different recognitions from different times, but part of the same story. Their story, her continuing story. Helen Ross, widow, nurse, leader, ready to stand again when needed. The next morning, she woke early and did something she hadn't done in years. She put on hiking boots, packed a small emergency kit, and drove to the mountain trails where she and Edward had once trained recruits. The paths would be different now, reshaped by seasons and storms, but she would learn them again, memorize the terrain, note the shelters and danger zones. Not because she expected disaster, but because she now understood preparedness wasn't just about survival, it was about purpose. And purpose, once rediscovered, deserved to be honored. That night, as Helen sat on the porch with the wind whispering through the pine, she didn't think of medals or headlines. She thought of Edward's quiet nod whenever she made the right call, and of the fire in her bones that hadn't dulled. Some people fade after loss, but others become the storm's calm center and hold steady until the light returns. Have you ever seen someone ignored, who then became the person everyone relied on? Comment about a time when you saw calmness and experience save an entire situation. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where the quietest people carry the loudest lessons.